Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll get started. So good afternoon and welcome to the New Hampshire Energy Forward, Optimizing Distributed Energy Resources to Lower Costs session. I'm Dina Dennis. I'm Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs with the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire, also known as CPCNH or the Coalition. CPCNH is a joint powers agency of 65 member municipalities and 4 counties, and we represent just under 40% of the state's population. Part of CPCNH's founding mission is to enable greater market competition for retail power supplies, including distributed energy resources, or DERs, and other value-added services that serve customers and community needs. And to clarify by what I mean by distributed energy resources, we're talking about distributed generation, distributed storage that's connected to the distribution edge of the grid, plus flexible customer technologies such as heat pumps, electric vehicles, and smart thermostats. So CPCNH, we want to accelerate a cost-effective energy transition in New Hampshire, and we think that optimizing DERs, particularly through enabling a local within New Hampshire market, will help achieve that goal. Since the New Hampshire Community Power Act was passed in 2019, we've been working to shape the market for community power and with it enable a competitive market for DERs. And as part of our efforts, we've mapped out the exact barriers to enabling this market, and we've devised solutions that we'll be seeking through legislative action next year. And my colleague Cliff will be speaking in more detail to those barriers and to those solutions. A big part of this involves addressing the underlying utility infrastructure and regulatory barriers that are holding back private sector innovation that prevents them from helping customers. This is because innovation always outpaces regulation, and utilities have not kept up with the pace that's needed to allow this to happen. And that's why we're here today, to talk about how we can finally enable a market to innovate without needing to seek approval by a regulatory commission and go through a 2-year adjudicatory process. This new community power model of local governance by and for communities, as is for CPCNH, involves making decisions together with our members about how to run the power agency to stabilize and lower energy costs, while unlocking opportunities for new technologies and services to help customers lower their energy costs. As customers continue to adopt DERs, the need for flexing them smartly, such as through distributed or virtual power plants to support system needs and efficiency, will grow significantly. Rate and pricing innovations that are designed to optimize investment and or shift usage away from high price periods to reduce peak demand will help lower costs for everyone. We've got a really great lineup of speakers, and many of whom bring expertise as former or current state utility regulators, state legislators, consumer advocates. We have an aggregator and a competitive supplier, and I know each of them are really excited to be here to share some of their insight on this discussion. So this time, I want to briefly introduce each speaker, and I'll go in the order that they will present. And then we'll have maybe a 20-minute or so moderated discussion before we open it up for audience questions. So first up, we'll be hearing from Clifton Below. Clifton is chair of the board of directors for the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire. In this role, he's responsible for helping the coalition advance the legislative reforms that will advance a local market for DERs. In addition to CPCNH, Clifton serving his 10th year as a city councilor and 5th year as assistant mayor for the city of Lebanon in New Hampshire. Previously, Cliff served in the New Hampshire House and the Senate and also as a public utilities commissioner. He co-authored and sponsored New Hampshire's first in the nation Electric Utility Restructuring Act and the New Hampshire Net Metering Law. He was also the prime author of New Hampshire's Community Power Act of 2019. Over the decades, Cliff has served in various leadership capacities with regional and national organizations, including the New England Conference of Public Utility Commissioners, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, the Electric Power Research Institute, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and the NARUC/Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Demand Response and Smart Grid Collaborative. Next, we'll hear from the Honorable Philip Bartlett. Chairman Bartlett was appointed to the Maine Public Utilities Commission in June 2019 by Governor Janet Mills. Prior to his appointment, he practiced in law with the firm Scotcha, Bartlett, and Chabot. Previously, Chairman Bartlett served in the Maine Senate and also served as Senate Majority Leader for 2 years. Notably, he chaired the Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee, as well as the Joint Select Committee on Maine's Energy Future. Chairman Bartlett also serves as chair of the New England Conference of Public Utility Commissioners Retail Demand Response and Load Flexibility Working Group, which is a regional initiative that's exploring issues related to how demand response and flexible loads can serve as a resource and support New England's challenges related to resource adequacy and peak demand growth. Next, we will hear from Travis Kavula. Travis is Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for NRG, a leading North American retail supplier with operations across several retail choice markets in the United States. In New Hampshire, you might be familiar with some of NRG's affiliates, including Direct Energy and Reliant Energy, that are operating as competitive suppliers. Direct Energy is also providing service to a few community power aggregations in the state, including the city of Keene and the town of Swansea. In his role, Travis is responsible for guiding the company's regulatory policy related to wholesale and retail electricity, gas, and environmental attributable markets at both the federal and state levels. Prior to joining NRG, Travis led the energy program for the R Street Institute, a free markets-oriented think tank. Travis currently is a lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Before that, he was elected and served 8 years on the Montana Public Service Commission, including as chairman. While he was on the Montana Commission, he was elected by his national peers as president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, also known as NARUC, and has since become a global expert and thought leader in the areas of energy regulation and an advocate for competitive markets. Lastly, but not leastly, we will hear from David Collada. Dave is Vice President of Policy for SEALD, an aggregator that's working to eliminate home energy waste by enabling contractors to install home weatherization and electrification projects. In this role, he leads the company's regulatory and legislative efforts to advance energy efficiency, building electrification, and virtual power plants. Before he joined SEALD, he served as executive director of the Illinois Citizens Utility Board, a legislatively created consumer advocacy nonprofit that's dedicated to fighting for the rights of customers of investor-owned utilities across Illinois. Under Dave's leadership, the Citizens Utility Board became an innovative thought leader, was dubbed as the gold standard of consumer groups nationwide by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and Dave was heavily involved in negotiating policies in Illinois related to performance-based regulation, access to data, and retail pricing programs. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Clifton Below.
Good afternoon. I'm sort of going to skip this one because it was kicked us off earlier at the start of the day. Just a bit of background on the coalition. Just do a really brief history of distributed energy resource policy in New Hampshire. In 1978, New Hampshire enacted the Limited Electrical Producers Act, called LEPA, RSA 362A, which was a few months in advance of federal enactment of the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act of 1978, both of which created opportunities for non-utility-owned independent power producers, and that was really the start of independent power producers. In New Hampshire, it was focused on generation up to 5 megawatts. In 1996, we enacted RSA 374F to create a restructured system, electric utility system, where generation was moved to a competitive market, and it sought to enable all customers to have a choice of their supplier. Also included important principles about customers being able to have their own on-site generation. In 1998, a couple of years later, we updated the LIPA statute to create net metering and relieve the utilities of the obligation to purchase from limited producers, and added to that purpose statement what is bolded at the bottom, the notation that it was found by the legislature that these goals of the statute should be pursued in a competitive environment pursuant to the restructuring policy principles. There were also subsequently a couple of laws creating 374H and G. G concerned utilities being able to make certain investments in distributed energy resources, and H is sort of sets out some policy goals for storage. Using the Dunsky value of distributed energy resources, which includes live spreadsheets that you can download from the DOE website, we did some analysis of the costs versus the potential savings for both standalone PV, and you can see that the major components are energy, capacity, but also transmission, avoided transmission cost, which was featured prominently in the Dunsky study. But what you can also see is that PV plus battery greatly expands that value proposition at a cost that is somewhat more, but produces more value. But that is not yet really enabled in New Hampshire. So that, enabling storage in conjunction with generation is a key to optimizing these values. What we sort of see as a vision building off of existing policy is enabling a local market for distributed energy resources that can help lower cost. You get price signals from the wholesale market, energy, ancillary services, capacity, transmission. Unlock those through market reforms, competitive market suppliers, competitive electric power suppliers, community power aggregations, and developers can intermediate these prices, and then customers and customer and community scale DERs can respond to those price signals. And we are referring into this context to resources that are under 5 megawatts that are functioning as load reducers relative to the ISO New England system. What we're proposing conceptually is a New Hampshire Energy Forward Act to enable a local market for DERs, and that would be through several key reforms: reaffirming New Hampshire's energy policy principles and purpose, modernizing load settlement to support value-driven DER growth, unlocking price signals for avoided transmission and generation capacity values, and authorizing interval metering for DER customers on an opt-in basis. And also requiring more improved open access to data sharing and non-discriminatory billing options for suppliers. And there's some other details that we'll not really address today. But that having a level playing field with the utilities for billing options is important. And just as an example, they've implemented time of use rates, but competitive suppliers and CPAs can't offer the same time of use rate structures that the utilities do. Reaffirming New Hampshire's policy principles starts with recognizing state authority over within state wholesale sales. That's where the power is generated and consumed at the retail level within the state for both wholesale and retail sales to enable a local market. It's reaffirming customer and community choice of suppliers, including the right of net metered customers and time of use customers to choose suppliers other than utility default service, and the right of customer generators where they have exports to the grid to use that to recognize that as a reduction in their ISO New England wholesale load obligation of their supplier. And there's something cut off here. Commitment to enabling retail customers to see and respond to temporal price signals. One of the keys is modernizing load settlement. Load settlement is the process that the utilities administer to calculate how much power each supplier has to purchase from ISO New England for each hour of the day. Current law, there is a requirement in current law that says shall be accounted for as a reduction or to the wholesale load obligation of the supplier serving net metered customers. Yet that has yet to be implemented. So modernizing load settlement, so suppliers are only charged for their load net of local generation that they are procuring to serve their customers, will support value-driven growth in DERs, and ensure that the benefits are accurately apportioned to those that cause them and minimize cost shifting. The key to this is unlocking, another key to this is unlocking price signals for avoided generation capacity and transmission values. These are recognized in the Dunsky study, which everyone affirmed as being a very legitimate and valued a study that was, the accuracy of it was not generally questioned by any of the parties in the net metering proceeding. So part of this is requiring implementing a mechanism to credit DERs for actual avoided transmission and capacity charges when they export to the grid at monthly and annual system peaks, hours of system peak, when these charges are incurred. It's worth noting that all three of our investor-owned utilities, as well as the co-op, all three of them have filed testimony at the commission where they have proposed utility investments in distributed generation or storage that counts on the value of avoided transmission and capacity costs to justify the utility investment. It's just part of the equation. And in two of those cases, the commission has approved that those projects move forward based on that value stack that the Dunsky study recognized. The other major key component is authoring smart interval meters for DER customers on an opt-in basis. Accurate, reliable, timely data is essential to know how much customers are using or producing in a given time interval, particularly for unlocking temporal values, and suppliers need to have access to interval metering infrastructure to optimize DERs. A lot of the value, and the Dunsky study clearly showed that, much of the value is temporal. It's based on when it produces, which is why coupling storage with distributed generation adds so much value, because you can absorb excess power around solar noon that a lot of PV systems generate and re-release it later in the afternoon or evening when the demand is much higher. And coincident peaks, you can start to shave those coincident peaks, shift load to less peaky hours, and in that way we sort of accommodate more growth in load for beneficial electrification or AI data centers or whatever within the existing capacity. You know, we're obviously going to need more capacity, but the question is trying to optimize the value of the capacity that we got, and these temporal price signals are critical. So just, you know, three key takeaways. Deploying DERs could be the most cost-effective option for New Hampshire, but only if markets can monetize their value. Enabling suppliers to flex DERs in response to temporal price signals will lower cost and support the grid. And policy directives to put these mechanisms in place are needed to allow this to occur. And I'll just make one final comment. There was a recent column in Utility Dive by former FERC commissioners Wellinghoff and Chatterley, one Democrat, one Republican, and they make the case that one of the most beneficial things we could do in terms of electricity policy is better enable distributed resources, because they point out as demand grows, large-scale central power plants or offshore wind or whatever takes years and years to implement, whereas DERs can be implemented much more quicker and often at lower cost. So thank you. We're going to skip over some bonus slides about jurisdictional issues and hand this off.
Before we move to our next speaker, if I could take the moderator's prerogative and ask one quick clarifying question of you, Cliff, and I'll give this microphone to you when I'm done asking the question. I believe as it relates to the load settlement process, and that's a function that utilities are administering, I believe you mentioned that New Hampshire already has a law that states that exports to the grid shall be accounted for through a reduction to each supplier's wholesale load obligation. But is it the case that suppliers are not credited for exports to the grid?
Correct. And the law does say adjusted for line losses as determined by the Commission. And the Commission has not made that determination or determined how or when to implement this. And the utilities are arguing that where it says shall be accounted for in this way doesn't really mean shall. What it means is only if the Commission determines that it's in the public interest or that the cost of doing so would be reasonable and result in just and reasonable rates. That's not how we read the law, but that's the nub of the issue at the moment.
Great, thank you. So at this time, we'll turn to our next speaker, Chairman Bartlett.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I thought I would talk a little bit about sort of what I see as the problem we're trying to solve with distributed resources, and then talk a bit about some of the work that we're doing sort of in Maine and regionally to try to tackle that. It's first and foremost, I think there's been a lot of discussion already today that DERs play an important role in helping to build resilience into the grid. We are seeing more extreme weather. We're never going to solve the power outages, but you can have a lot of local resilience that you can develop through a wide-scale deployment of DERs, particularly when you start thinking about that broadly, beyond just a typical solar panel, but you start thinking about your EVs as DERs. There's just tremendous potential to help to build resiliency into the grid. We also know it can help with reliability by having these resources available and distributed when there's a large power plant that goes down or there's a big transmission line that's lost. You can have significant reliability benefits simply by having these resources available to deploy. We also know it will reduce our transmission and delivery costs. The more resources we have close to home, the fewer transmission lines we have to build. When you think about it in the context of non-wireless alternatives, you have to upgrade your distribution system to accommodate load growth. If you can incorporate smart DERs, you can significantly lower the amount of the delivery system upgrades you're going to need in order to electrify kind of everything, which is where we're headed. It also allows you to bring on more renewables, which is, I think, a societal benefit in and of itself, and extend the use of those renewables, particularly in the context of storage. One of the challenges that we're going to have is making sure how do we stretch the value of that solar as many hours a day as possible. In Maine, we're also thinking about on and offshore wind. How do we get the maximum hours out of those renewables possible? And particularly distributed storage systems can play a huge role, as well as other mechanisms to improve load flexibility. As we think about how to promote these, I think there are kind of two big buckets. You can either develop sort of very programmatic solutions where we're going to sort of develop a clearly defined program that you can tap into in order to deploy DERs. And then the second method is trying to develop market mechanisms that can present the right price signals to better accommodate it. And the reality is that at least over the short, medium term, we're going to need a combination of both. I mean, in an ideal world, we would move to a great market structure where the price signals were localized, they were quick, there was rapid response, and you wouldn't necessarily need to build programs around it. But the reality is, for a while, we're likely to need sort of a pairing of very specific programs, but also changing some of those price signals. So one of the keys, I think, from a market perspective is really beginning to integrate more variable pricing into rates. We're so used to electricity just paying one rate all the time, and customers love it. It's hard to make that change, but we have to start moving to either very simple time of use rates so that we at least get people to stop using during the peak so that we can lower costs, but then eventually move into much more flexible pricing. I mean, you would love to have some sort of a supplier or aggregator that's responding to real-time prices that is then sending signals down to the retail level. In Maine, for example, we have opened a time of use proceeding looking to develop opt-out time of use rates for both our standard offer supply as well as our delivery rates. I'll talk about that more later if you want. There's a ton of resistance to that from all kinds of quarters, but we think it's really critical, both in terms of sending the right signal to the kinds of DERs we need to deploy in the system and the types of demand response we're going to need over the long term, but also really can help with affordability. If you're struggling to pay your electric bill and you know you can save $10 or $15 a month by simply changing when you are drying your clothes, that can have a meaningful impact on people's pockets. We also have realized, as we've been thinking about demand response programs, that we have to increase the visibility to ISO New England into what we're doing if we're really going to get the benefit from it. We had an example this summer on August 11th, where a generator tripped off and ISO New England called an OP4 event. Basically, it's the first abnormal status alert that they give. And what they saw very quickly when the prices spiked is 300 megawatts drop off the demand just instantly. And they assumed and later concluded, I think, that that was the result of retail demand response programs that they had no idea were going to operate. So they're making operational decisions in the control room, and they're building out their system to deal with operational challenges without an awareness of these retail demand response programs. So I think as a regulator's perspective, we need to be thinking about how do we better coordinate what we're doing at the retail level with the wholesale markets, because that's how you can get both the value out of it, but also for an operational value, but also can eventually develop the market structures to incentivize this without needing specific programs. Non-wireless alternatives are another mix. You can set those up so it's a mix of sort of a programmatic and market-based solution. In Maine, we have a non-wireless alternative program where any transmission or distribution investment above a certain size gets reviewed for non-wireless alternative treatment. I think in an ideal world, you can put these out to bid and you can see what the market can produce in terms of solutions, as opposed to simply assuming you have to make multi-million-dollar investments in your electric system. So I think a lot more work can and should be done to develop how we build the NWA process into the planning process with a lot of lead time so that we can really solicit competitive solutions to solve some of the challenges that our grids are going to be facing. And then I would also note that as we are thinking about really trying to wring the most value and optimizing the value of DERs, we need to incorporate locational incentives. We need to make sure the information is available to developers, and we need to make sure that we're putting these things where they make the most sense. In Maine, we've had robust interest in distributed solar. A lot of these projects, though, are going in very rural parts of the state. So you're not saving the kind of distribution system savings that you would have if those were much closer to the load that you're serving. So you want to think about, okay, if we know these are a lot more valuable in certain places, how do we send the right financial market signal to make that happen? I did want to talk about a couple of initiatives that were going on in Maine, and then I'll end with a discussion of the demand response working group here in the region. As I mentioned, we have an ongoing time of use proceeding. If anyone wants to weigh in on that, we would love to hear from you. And part of that is really trying to build support. And I think we see the benefits both in terms of an affordability perspective and also keeping costs down over the long term by starting to just get people to understand that when they use their electricity matters and provide an incentive to help to reduce the peak. That is easier said than done, but we know that there are billions of dollars in savings in the region if all the New England states can get on board. ISO New England did an analysis of what it would take to kind of build out the grid to 2050 based on the renewable goals and the electrification that's coming. And they identified that if you could sort of reduce the peak demand beyond about 10% beyond those projections, you could save 30 to 40% of the cost. That's billions and billions of dollars of savings to ratepayers by getting this right. We also have a resilience docket open, and this is another place where I think DERs can play a huge, huge role to think about not just how we harden our systems, the utilities can harden the systems, but how do we strategically deploy distributed resources to minimize the impact of these storms, these outages, to make communities more resilient, make sure they're safer, and try to come up with a strategy that can be deployed across the state. Third, we have a grid planning process in Maine that the legislature sort of required us to start doing integrated grid planning, which we hadn't done since deregulation back around the year 2000. And as part of that process, we had almost 100 stakeholders come in to join this proceeding to help us to identify what are the key priorities that we want the utilities to plan to. And I think this was out of recognition that the utilities have their core functions, but all the rest of us need the system to be doing a lot more than what they may need it, right? If you want to be connecting distributed resources, you need a system that has the data, that has the capability, and can kind of point you in the right direction for where to go. And so we had a lengthy process and identified some core priorities that the utilities are in the process of planning to, and they will come back with those plans in just over or almost a year and a half. As part of that, one of the key takeaways was that we needed to make sure the utilities are collecting the right kind of data and then making it publicly available so that folks have it, can plan to it, and we can start building the kind of incentive structure to get the results that we want. And it's hard to fault the utilities that they, in the sense that they didn't have a need to collect certain kinds of data, but now that we know that kind of we need it, we need to make sure that they are incentivized to not only provide and update that data, but to make sure it's very easy and accessible for other folks who want to connect to the grid. And finally, I'll just conclude with a brief discussion of the NECPUC Demand Response Working Group. And this really came out of discussions in the region around two things. One was sort of that cost, as we were looking to the grid of the 2050 future, we were looking at the enormous costs that were coming our way and recognized that demand response was potentially a tool that we could deploy across the region to significantly lower those costs for our ratepayers. And then secondly, the region has been struggling with serious winter reliability issues for a long, long time. It's like almost every winter we get into the discussions about whether we're going to have enough natural gas flowing through the system, whether there's going to be enough oil available for replenishment, are we going to be able to survive a 2-week-long cold snap should one come along. And so we started to, as the ISO New England was doing some analysis and looking at what the potential shortfalls were, you could see that it's really a matter of a few hours here and there that over that 21-day period that were really, really critical. Could we develop a different kind of a demand response program that would essentially sort of defer or push off certain types of demand during those cold snaps? Now, this isn't your traditional demand response program because we're not asking you to move your demand by a few hours because that doesn't do much over a 21-day period. But what you could start thinking about is, can we develop programs so that big commercial office spaces shut down for 2 or 3 days and have all their workers work remotely? These are solutions that were unthinkable probably 5 years ago, but post-COVID, most businesses can now do that, right? So are there new kinds of demand response that we could put into place that could really save the region? I mean, probably hundreds of billions of dollars. We've put so many sort of market fixes and incentives into place trying to solve this winter reliability issue. If we can use demand response to cut back those costs, that is huge savings and I think allows for much better deployment of the renewables across the region because we don't have to be quite so worried about keeping that last oil plant open just in case we need it in an emergency. So that will stop and sort of look forward to your question of the future.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Clifton and Phil, for going first. I was busy here editing my comments, trying to delete the redundancies and improve on the amplifications, which I hope I'll do here today. Travis Kavula, again, I work for NRG. We have about 8 million customers across North America, and about 500,000 of those are through community choice and municipal aggregation programs in New England. Altogether, we serve about 10% of the electricity of the eastern wholesale markets. So that includes ISO New England, PJM, and the New York ISO. And we're present basically anywhere in North America where consumers have a choice in their provider, either directly or through their communities. So the good news is New Hampshire's policy of restructuring that Clifton has talked about has been, on its own terms, quite a success. You see a high rate of shopping for commercial and industrial customers. All industrial customers, I think bar none, buy their power from the open competitive market in New Hampshire. 80% of commercial customers choose to buy their power from someone other than the incumbent utility's standard rate offer, but only 30% of residential customers do the same. That itself is a great improvement, however, and is nearly double what it was 2 years ago due to the advancements in community choice aggregation. So that third of residential customers that you're now seeing being supplied by the competitive retail market is sort of a success of the coalition that you're here hearing from today. It's also led to real savings. Based on the latest data that became available earlier this month, in 2023, New Hampshire retail customers who did shop or were provided service through their municipality saved in aggregate about $40 million over the course of the year relative to what they would have paid for the utility basic service. So a good win there. And by, over time, our retail models have developed with particular attention to the commercial and industrial classes to try to get more and help those customers manage their costs in terms of the energy commodity. So you see a lot of the largest customers in New Hampshire have agreements with retail suppliers where they agree at a certain price point when observed in the ISO New England wholesale market to back down certain functions in their business, to cycle grocery stores' air conditioning, to turn off or interrupt industrial operations, and then take the electricity that otherwise would have been designated to serve them and instead sell it back into the wholesale market of ISO New England, earning them a tidy profit in the process. If they can make that demand flexibility into some kind of firm commitment, they can turn around and sell that capacity into the ISO New England market, further monetizing that behavior. Unfortunately, we don't really see any of that happening yet with the residential customer class in New England, and that's candidly because of a tyranny of small numbers. It's harder to make it all pencil out only on the basis of the energy commodity, which after all, if any of you pay close attention to your bill, is probably only half or less of your average bill on a monthly basis. The other stuff you pay for, be it capacity, which sometimes is bundled with energy, transmission, distribution, and non-bypassable costs, constitute a significant expense on people's bills, and sometimes despite being demand-related, in other words, driven by the demand peaks of customers using more and more energy during a particular time, those rates don't find expression in demand pricing or in any other pricing that would allow a customer, be they a large customer or a small customer, to monetize their reduction in demand. And that's really where the rubber meets the road in the bar charts that Clifton was showing, is that there is a hypothetical valuation possible to be made around a distributed energy resource which produces a lot of value by reducing consumers' use during certain times when the transmission grid is most stressed, but there is no practical way at the current moment for any residential customer in the state of New Hampshire to monetize that value. And that leads to a significant suppressive effect on the adoption of distributed energy resources. And just to dive down, since we have three former current utility commissioners here, I'm going to briefly dive down the rabbit hole of exactly how transmission rates work. Please don't leave. This will be very quick. Basically, every dollar that a transmission utility spends in expense, in capital investment, ends up in the ISO New England's so-called revenue requirement for transmission, which is then broken out into the various transmission owners that exist within the ISO New England. Those individual revenue requirements are then allocated to electric distribution companies and their customer classes on something called a 12 coincident peak basis. In other words, you take all of the residential customers in the Eversource service territory in New Hampshire, and whatever those customers are using on the highest peak day of all of the 12 given months forms their basis of the share of transmission costs that they have to pay. And it's stated in a $1 per kilowatt month rate. The utility then takes that $1 per kilowatt month rate, which again is driven by all of your contributions to the peak, and divides it by the volume of energy that you use. In other words, the kilowatt hours of energy that you use. And that spits out a simple cents per kilowatt hour rate that you pay in transmission. So even if you were avoiding using 1 kilowatt hour of energy, during that peak hour of the month, that forms the basis of all of the allocation of upstream transmission costs to you, you only capture a very small fraction, if hardly any, of the actual value of that demand reduction. You could effectively avoid, if you were up to it, all of your usage on each of those 12 hours of any 12 given months, and you would only be rewarded 12 8,760ths of the total value of your demand reduction, rather than getting the bargain that, frankly, you should be getting, which is a 100% reduction for that kilowatt hour of reduced transmission costs. And this adds up, let me tell you, to a lot of money. Transmission costs in ISO New England have risen 800% since the year 2004, far outpacing inflation. In the same time period in real dollars, energy costs have actually declined. And we're approaching a phase where energy supply, while it is very volatile and can be on average quite expensive, where I think transmission might actually surpass it in the fullness of time as a cost on consumers' bill. So if you're setting up a market, which, as we should know from economics, has two sides, a supply side and a demand side, and you're saying that demand can only have an active role relative to the energy commodity, which may end up being only a third of your bill in the fullness of time, you're creating a structural and institutional handicap for anyone who might want to do anything from energy efficiency to demand response to distributed energy resource reduction. So to sort of underline what Clifton is saying, that's why legislative initiatives like his are so important in the context of this space. It basically stands for the proposition that if you're going to have a restructured model, as does exist in New Hampshire, where you see people like the coalition flourishing and taking market share, you need to be sure that those business models are able to capture and monetize the full scope of value for the demand reductions they engage in, and ideally that individual customers are able to do the same by seeing pricing like Phil was talking about that has some time varying rate component. I'll leave it there, but for one point, which is that, as Clifton said, we do see some developments on the utility side of things, where utilities have started programs to try to put distributed energy resources into consumers' homes. Eversource, for example, has a program that puts smart thermostats into consumers' home under the label Connected Solutions. But there, too, there's a problem of split incentives that, while they may have justified it in the spending in terms of regulatory math, the actual functionality of these thermostats are not doing anything to reduce the transmission and capacity obligations of the system as a whole. They seem to be targeting distribution peaks and not necessarily the peaks that actually have a round-trip consequence in terms of what consumers can pay. So it's a problem where in a restructured market like this, where suppliers tend to be responsible for energy and capacity costs, and the utility has tended to be responsible for distribution and transmission costs, you need business models, again, that are able to stack all those values together. And if you don't, then you're going to end up, if you do have any distributed energy resources at all, they're going to end up being half-stranded assets because they're not actually able to chase that full stack of values. Look forward to the Q&A, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's great to be here. My name is David Collada, and I am the Vice President of Policy for SEALD. We are a climate tech company with a mission to stop home energy waste and electrify homes. We work with contractors. That's who our customer is at the end of the day. And our software and solutions make it easy for contractors to take advantage of utility or state or city or CCA incentive programs so that ultimately they can install more home weatherization and electrification projects and grow their business. Now, I agree with everything that was said previously here, but one thing I've observed is when we're talking about this energy transition and we're talking about a movement to increase DERs and increase competition in virtual power plants, that it can seem very complicated and very difficult because there are some big wholesale changes that are likely needed in utility business models and state regulatory processes, et cetera. And it's true that those questions are there. But one of the things that we face now, every state, but New Hampshire it certainly has some choices ahead of them, where we can actually take stepwise movement in that direction if we do policy right. In other words, we don't have to bite everything off at once and try to deal with all of the problems. We can actually start moving from the ground up, making certain policy decisions, getting a framework going that over time we think leads in this direction. And on that front, as I'm sure everyone in this audience is aware, that obviously there was the Inflation Reduction Act, where there are two big IRA rebate programs, the HOMES program and the HERE program. New Hampshire is set to get about $35 million of both. We support both programs, obviously, but what I'm going to talk about in my remaining time today is the HOMES program, which is sort of your efficiency rebates for whole home savings and households, because there's a policy choice that we face right now that is very consistent and very important for the conversation we're having to date. And that is, do you want to do the modeled savings option, the measured savings option, or both? Now, our core policy recommendation is you do both. They both have value. I think it's been a misnomer that somehow it's an either or. They work seamlessly together. But I do think over time that it is the measured option that provides more value, particularly from a DER optimization point of view. Just to provide a little bit more detail, modeled is kind of what it sounds like, where you're using physics models to say this is what a house would be expected to be. Expected, the model shows it'll be 15 or 20% savings, and you get a rebate based off of that. In the measured case, you're using actual data. In other words, you're only essentially paying rebates for what you can prove before and after. One thing I will note here is that because the aim of the Inflation Reduction Act in this section is market transformation, the modeled here is not your everyday modeled. It actually is a new standard. It's called BPI 2400. The BPI is the Building Performance Institute, which sets these type of standards. The 2400, as far as I can tell, is a random number. But key to that is that you actually need, some people think, oh, measured, you need data, which is true, and I'll get to that. But actually, in the modeled BPI 2400 standard, you need the exact same data because you need to calibrate those models over time to get them better and better. So the idea here is that they can work together as we get more measurement. It improves the models, and you kind of have a ratcheting up. A lot of states, we're seeing so far at least, are buying that. Some, and New Hampshire appears to be one of them, are viewing that maybe only do modeled, and I will get to that and why I think that that's a mistake. But just very quickly, of some of the benefits that we see to measured savings, it is a market-based approach using actual data. I do think it's consistent with a competitive philosophy and framework. The next slide we'll get into, when you look at the formula that was put in the statute of how you determine what the rebate will be for a household, it turns out that it will mean more money for the average household under the measured approach than the modeled approach. There's a big taxpayer accountability and consumer protection aspect to measured savings. My previous job, it was mentioned, I was a consumer advocate in the state of Illinois. One of the reasons I was so excited to come to SEALD is that, which fundamentally measured savings is core to our business, is that we know that efficiency works, and I'm not saying otherwise, but there is performance risk associated with it, right? A project can go in. How do you know what it really saved? Maybe the work wasn't as good as it should have been. And right now, that performance risk is borne solely by the household, right? If a job wasn't done as well as it should be, they're on the hook. With measured savings, it switches that performance risk to the private sector. Our whole business model is that we will pay the rebate up front immediately, pay at the speed of business, and we will get paid back at the speed of the program. And so concretely, let's say a rebate was supposed to be, we thought it was going to be $5,000. We give the household $5,000. If it turned out, based on measurement, a year later, it was only $4,000, we eat that. So it is a switching of this performance risk, and ultimately you're only paying for savings that you can prove that we think has quite a bit of value. This is an understated thing that I think we're emphasizing more and more. And that measured savings, as you look at the country right now, especially in an era of load growth, this grid reliability issue is becoming more and more important, right? We're in the middle of this energy transition. It's essential that we decarbonize. At the same token, many parts of the Northeast still have reliability must run coal plants or fossil plants, because we have to make sure that the lights stay on. Well, when it comes to energy efficiency in the demand side, grid operators, be they utilities or ISOs, they require, at the end of the day, that resources be measured. Even then, they may not like it, and that's a whole separate story that we certainly want to push the ISOs to do better. But they require things to be measured. They're not going to take on faith that a resource is going to be there unless it can be quantified. We're big believers in the demand side. Our business model is based on that entirely in a virtual power plant world. But the demand side needs to step up and meet the same requirements of the supply side. It can, but it needs to be measured, right? We can't have a world where you're just assuming you're investing in energy efficiency, but a grid operator says, well, we're not going to count that because we don't know it's there. That's not an effective use of our investment. And then lastly, there is, I think, a big aspect of rewarding innovation, which is increasingly important in this state, and high-quality work. This last one, the high-quality work, if you kind of think of the incentive structure in a measured savings universe, it's sort of a race to the top, because the more savings you can get, particularly relative to the investment you're making, the higher the rebate, the more value is created. Right now, even though, like I said, we support modeled and even deemed savings programs, right now the incentive structure is sort of the reverse. You get the same rebate regardless of the quality of work. And there also can be an incentive to kind of oversize systems, put more money in than you might need, just from a sales point of view. So I think that rewarding high-quality work, getting this race to the top, and kind of aligning the whole contractor community with state public policy goals is a real big advantage of the measured approach. This very quickly is just, this is based on ResNet or ResStock data and what it's projected to be. And you'll see that, on the measured approach, that the average household is expected to get, combined for low and moderate income would be almost $14,000 per project. The modeled would be $8,000 in that case. That's because modeled is sort of set in statute. It's $2,000 or $4,000, and then doubled for low and moderate income. In the case of measured, there's a formula, and that formula is also doubled. But the way the formula works, you're likely going to get significant more value for a particular homeowner. And that, at the end of the day, I think increases affordability. Another thing to note here is that the savings thresholds you have to meet under the IRA to get a rebate in the first place are lower with measured than with modeled. Modeled, you have to meet a 20% average savings. With measured, it's 15%. Why did Congress do that? Well, at the end of the day, I think it's fair to say they know that modeled isn't as accurate, so they're giving it a little bit more higher goal that you need to achieve. So we think that there are really big benefits for including measured savings. So I've got a couple recommendations to end up here. We believe that New Hampshire should include a measured savings pilot in its homes implementation plan. It's our understanding right now that that's not the plan. However, we have heard that there's been some talk about this, which is one of the reasons I'm here. In other words, we don't think it's a fait accompli. We definitely think that there's still an option. And it is something that we know from talking to the Department of Energy, people implementing this, that they're interested in states continuing to iterate on their plans. So we still think that there's room here. If we do this right, this can be a down payment on virtual power plants. It's not going to get us all the way there, but it is very concrete steps that a state can take to start moving in this direction and making things kind of VPP eligible or VPP ready while we develop, some of these bigger public policy decisions around that. One thing I will say is that, ideally, the pilot would also include location and time for the reasons that Travis and the Commissioner mentioned. And an interesting part of the Inflation Reduction Act is it actually requires every state to come up with a time, location, or GHG plan. To date, only very recently did DOE even put out guidance on this. So a lot of states that have applied already have said things like, well, we're considering it, we don't know what to do. The reason they didn't know what to do is they were waiting, right? I get that. But there are some really cool things that you could do in a pilot just by valuing time and location, where you in sending the right kind of price signals that wouldn't even require any other changes that we were talking about here, well, all of a sudden the rebate makes sure that when you're putting in a heat pump, you're sending a massive incentive to work with a company like Harvest Thermal or someone else providing essentially a battery-like solution. The economics of that actually are pretty good and pencil out. So just by making some policy decisions, you can get some interesting new business models, I think jump-started. And then my last recommendation here is we clearly have a great opportunity with the HOMES program to get some things going. But over time, energy efficiency in general, I think, needs to move in this measured direction. It's really time for efficiency to get real. That doesn't mean that everything needs to be completely measured. I certainly understand there are circumstances when it may not make sense, where deemed and modeled are appropriate. But right now, you look at a state like Massachusetts, not to pick on them, they spend $1 billion a year on energy efficiency. All of it is essentially deemed. None of that can count for grid reliability purposes. That is not a sustainable long-term approach, even a medium-term approach for a state that wants to decarbonize in a cost-effective manner. That is a recipe for people eventually turning on efficiency and saying, wait a minute, why are we paying on this when we don't? The costs are clear, the benefits are there, but we can't quantify them, and they may not be as great as we think. So I think for those of us in the energy efficiency and grid optimization and demand flexibility space, it's really important that we start at least phasing in more measured, more quantitative, more let's make efficiency real perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Those were some really excellent and thought-provoking comments. I have a lot of questions. I also am recognizing time and the people in this room, and I want to give you all a chance to ask some questions. So I thought I'd start off with a couple, and then we could move into audience questions. My first question, and this is directed to Travis and Chairman Bartlett, and Dave, if you also have any insight to this, feel free to weigh in. So thinking back to Clifton's presentation, outlining what we've identified as the barriers for us as a supplier to offer various innovative rate designs and programs to flex distributed energy resources. Do these same barriers exist? So not getting the right data for billing purposes, not getting credits for exports to the grid and load settlement, not having access to these important temporal price signals. So do these barriers exist in other retail choice markets? If so, or where have you been able to resolve them? And as a consequence, what are customers able to do?
They do exist in other markets for sure. And it's worth kind of going back down memory lane to a time where you didn't have advanced metering infrastructure at all, but you did somehow have retail competition, a world in which we would offer a price to a customer. The customer would use energy over the course of a month, and then the retail supplier a month afterwards would find out from the utility what your customer had used. Didn't know when they used it, didn't know the quantity that they were using as the month progressed. No way to run a railroad. So now things have been better in the sense that you have advanced metering infrastructure and you can know both in more of a real-time basis when customers are using energy and how much. But often there is still latency associated with access to the data, as well as just bulk transfer capability issues associated with getting a lot of that data in a timely way for the purposes of load settlements. I mean, we're frequently having, due to utility data errors, to go back and resettle large commercial and industrial customers, and that's just not something we relish doing with the residential customers. A couple of the things that are substantial improvements. First is being able to use AMI for settlement quality purposes, including for the measurement of exports like you've proposed. One of the real benefits of working in Texas in terms of the balkanization of utility systems is that Texas required there to be a central repository of all smart data information regardless of the utility that it was sourced from. called Smart Meter Texas. So it's a single database that's queryable by any given supplier. And interestingly, in the Massachusetts energy omnibus legislation that has just come through pending a vote in the House, there's a centralized repository provided for there. That would be the second state in the nation to do so. Please don't tell them they're emulating Texas, or they'll do a givesies backsies thing. But that represents a great achievement to data access. A couple of other things that are parallel to this, but touch on it, I would say, are just making sure that some provision for accelerated switching exists. I mean, it often takes in certain jurisdictions a month, 2 months of billing cycles for a customer, once they make an affirmative selection to do something, when it's top of the mind, to actually getting flow and start receiving a bill around the selection that they've made, say from an alternative provider like a CCA. So with AMI, 3-day switching or even more instantaneous switching should be the standard. And then finally, Dina, something that you've talked about, supplier consolidated billing, basically turning the script and having utility data flow to the supplier, and then the supplier be in the position of having the responsibility, including for the collection of bad debt, for actually billing the customer and collecting on all charges, allows more interesting product offers, bill presentment, and frankly puts the person in the position of responsibility for sending you the bill that's actually a retail supplier, rather than the people who are fundamentally just supposed to be in charge of managing the poles and wires. That only exists in North America in Texas and Alberta, as well as in Georgia, which has a restructured market for gas, go figure, but it doesn't exist in any of the eastern markets. All those would be significant benefits to achieve on what you're talking about.
So barriers still exist, but we have made some progress. Recently we've had an explosion in community solar farms in Maine with subscribers, as I mentioned before, like a long way away. So one of the things that we were sort of discovering as we were working through this is some of those developers, the project sponsors, weren't getting the timely data that they needed. So there was this pretty lengthy delay in the ability to kind of settle things out, which creates all kinds of confusion for customers. So they did come together with the utilities, or at least one of the utilities, and identified kind of, here's the data we need. The utility said, okay, we can put this together for you in the format you need, but there'll be a cost to it, and ultimately they got to an agreement. So the developers essentially paid for the cost of acquiring that data. I would say that for folks who don't have AMI, sometimes they think, geez, if our utility would just get AMI, that's going to solve these problems. And the sad reality is that it doesn't. One of the things you quickly realize with AMI, that to make any change is going to take time and it's going to cost you millions of dollars. That seems to be kind of the rule no matter what we want to do. So I think, with that said, I think I think commissions are sort of have been catching on to this. We were sort of an early AMI state and probably didn't put in some early conditions that might have made things easier. But we are certainly working through those now in our grid planning and other processes. But I do think it's important that if you are working in this space and there's data that you need, work through your trade associations, work with the utilities, bring it to the commissions. We're happy to try to facilitate figuring out how to get you what you need, but it's also recognizing what's it going to take for the utility to do it, what's it going to cost, and then who's going to bear those costs. And if we're driving that through a proceeding at the PUC, that's a lot more complicated than a group of developers or a trade association or otherwise working with the utility to make sure that those costs are getting covered.
I think at this time we'll open it up to questions, and I think maybe Sam, or I can take the mic, and okay, Sam is going to take the roving mic, and as you all think about your questions, I might ask another question. So, the best laid plans, whether we're talking about enabling a local market or making programs smarter, like through a measured savings approach, it all comes down to the customer. So this question's to Dave, and of course, anybody else open to answering it. But what do customers need in order to make this work? And what do we need to do to prove to them that, there is significant value potential for them?
Yeah, I think, is this on? Yeah, from a To a large extent, it needs to be simple and set it and forget it. I don't think especially your average residential customer, this gets to a point that I think Travis was implicitly making. When you're a commercial customer, not only do you have people whose only job is to manage those costs, there's just a lot more money at stake. That's not going to be the case. It's still important, right? So as close as you can come to having a policy structure that is set it and forget it, the better off you're going to be. But that's, I think, why sending the right kind of price signals is so important. We mentioned smart thermostats earlier. The example I was talking about was with thermal storage for heat pumps. All those types of things, if you incent them, happen behind. No one needs to know about it. It's just sort of happening. And there are essentially no costs at all for the customer. And the more that we can go in that direction, the better off we are. That doesn't mean that you don't want to do consumer education. That doesn't mean that you can't have somewhat of a prosumer approach. But I don't think you should rely on it. One thing I will say is Illinois is the I think the only state where every residential customer has the option to be on an hourly pricing program, which I have been for well over a decade. And, one thing I will say on that front is that some of the marketing on that, I think, could be improved a little bit. There's a big environmental component on this. The average amount that a residential customer can save, I've saved about $1,200 over 10 years, $120. That's pretty good on an average year. That's good. For a lot of people, that's not. We've done a lot of, when I was in my previous job, we did a lot of focus groups, we did a lot of polling. People are kind of like, honestly, is that really worth it? But if you added the environmental component to that, then all of a sudden people are like, oh, I get it now. And so how we think about price signals and how we send those price signals, not only is price important, but also what is the carbon intensity of the marginal resource? And to the extent that we can develop products like that, I think we'll get a lot more. Travis is nodding his head. I'd be curious what you think, but I think we'd get a lot more uptake.
And just the ability to get prices to devices.
Yeah.
The ability to. I think having a trusted entity, and I think that's where community power aggregations feel that we have a significant role because we're by design for communities by communities. And if we can help customers automate some simple things like a heat pump hot water heater that has storage, and you just avoid charging it during the peak hours and charge it when cost is low and manage it in a way so that the customer always has hot water when they need it, but more intelligently. And that can all be automated so the customer doesn't have to have it top of mind.
100%.
So I'm going to be the elephant in the room, as you detect from my accent. I'm British. I'm a real fan of looking at global best practice. And interestingly, in the last 12 months in the UK, so if you look at New Hampshire versus the UK as an energy market, the UK is about twice the size. But just by having demand-side response, they managed to avoid starting gas-fired power plants 11 times, and they halved the cost and doubled the savings to consumers. So don't underestimate what can be done, and do look outside your borders for best practice. It's not the same. Sam and I were having this conversation the other day. Everything's the same, but nothing's the same. So what can you take away? But one of the biggest things about the time of use that we've seen in the UK, and again, I'm thinking about cost benefit. They just mandated that every utility had to create an API, a digital signal, for the real-time carbon intensity of the grid and a 2-day forecast. And then they asked every retailer to create an API, a digital API, for every time-based tariff. Now, the cost to each of those entities was tiny. This is software. But what it then did is unlocked all of the EV chargers, all of the heat pumps, all of the batteries, just to point at a digital signal. So sometimes these legislative changes actually don't need legislation, and sometimes they can have very small cost, very huge benefit. Yeah. So I would love New Hampshire to live off other people's mistakes and be a very fast follower. So it was more of a statement than a question, but I would love to kind of explore is how much can we learn collectively from global best practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot, and I know I'm a believer, as Phil knows, in time of use and time varying rates, at least partially because of the experience of Europe, where it's not uncommon at all to have a majority of entire national populations subscribed on even the hourly price product that Dave is talking to, not even the more tiered, flattish time of use product that we're talking about here. To your particular point, though, on avoiding gas, I mean, that is certainly our lived reality that we're dealing with in more mature markets like Texas, and I can see it developing here. And think about what we do as a supplier when we ink a deal with a town like Keene. I mean, we're agreeing to serve 10,000 customers who may shop elsewhere, they may grow over a 30-month period at a fixed price contract. In the absence of any distributed energy resources, what do we do to manage that risk? Well, we turn around and we sign tolling agreements with gas plants. We sign upstream financial swaps with large banks like Morgan Stanley or others, all of which have the purpose, effectively, of flowing revenue into, frankly, fossil generation to preserve their optionality to dispatch during times when prices are very high. In the past, we owned physical hedges, our own gas plants, which we've since sold. But an alternative physical hedge for us, as we've discovered in our Texas operations, really is having a fleet of, in our case, about 100,000 thermostats that are subject to our direct load control in the homes with their consent of customers who we dispatch several dozen times every summer in order to avoid turning on our gas plants or from buying power from the open market, which would also mean, since gas is always the marginal resource there, using more gas plants. So I don't know that good enough data exists in those markets to say we avoided turning one on, but you're certainly avoiding turning them up, and that much is demonstrated. So it's almost a way, I mean, if we could approach a community choice customer and the town of Keene was able to say, listen, we have 10,000 customers, and of those, we believe we can get 1,000 of them onto dispatchable thermostats, and that'll be part of the package that you can manage. That would lead to one of two things, or both. It would lead either to a lower price offer on a cents per kilowatt hour basis, because we would be able to shave our peak exposure, or it would allow us to facilitate the offer of a rebate to those particular consumers who choose to activate their demand. Again, that's sort of possible now when we're exposed to energy margins, but probably not economic. If we were able to toggle those devices in relation to transmission price signals and other demand-related price signals that make up the total package of supply, then they would pretty swiftly become economic based on ISO New England grid costs.
We are at time, but I am loath to just have one audience question, so I'm going to give one more question to whoever would like to ask one. In the back.
I'll try to make it quick, and I don't totally understand this, but forward capacity markets, I'm assuming that ISO New England participates in a forward capacity market, and where do DERs fit into a forward capacity market?
Phil, do you want to explain?
FERC recently issued a couple years ago Order 2222, which requires the utilities, the RTOs, and ultimately the utilities, to enable participation of DERs in our wholesale market. So the rules are still, not ironed out, and I can tell you there's a lot of work that's going to be done at the state level to make that effective. My bet is that Order 2220 isn't going to be the real solution here. You can do some aggregation for capacity, but it is, our market, I guess I'll just leave it at that for now. But our markets are currently in flux. A number of reforms are underway in terms of looking at capacity accreditation, which I think creates some opportunities to think differently about the role that DERs can play, both in the forward capacity market, but perhaps even more importantly in the energy markets.
And I just want to add, FERC Order 2222, which has directed regions like the ISO New England to enable smaller DERs to be aggregated and participate in the interstate federal wholesale market, is one approach, but another approach is to deploy them at the same annual system peak to reduce demand. And it turns out that a megawatt of reduction has equivalent to 1.2 to 1.4 times a megawatt participating in the wholesale market. So reducing the demand, or what's called the load obligation, actually has more value than increasing the supply. And part of the reason for that is the supply has to be designed to meet demand plus a safety margin. So when you reduce demand a little bit, you reduce the supply obligation even more. So that's why the Dunsky study, for instance, found that across the board, distributed energy resources have more value as a load reducer than as a participant in the federal market. And so it's a question of scale, what makes sense, which is why we're trying to argue for explicitly enabling a local market for these resources.
Great. Any other final thoughts? Please join me in thanking our panelists today.